They didn't even offer me coffee, just three men in tighter suits than they needed, sitting like they were already somewhere else. "We're restructuring," said the one in the middle, Jeff, I think, or Jim. He always spoke like his mouth was full of golf balls. "You've been a key asset over the years, Greg, but we're moving in a leaner direction." They called it realignment. I called it what it was, gutting the engine and painting the hood. No thanks for the 27 years. No severance. Not even a boxed up plaque. Just a beige envelope slid across the table with exit process typed at the top like a death certificate for relevance. I didn't say a word, just nodded once. I stood up, slower than I used to, and walked out without a sound. The halls looked different, colder. Maybe it was the fluorescent lighting, or maybe it was me finally noticing how much of this place I'd let bleed into my bones. Either way, it didn't matter. The doors whispered shut behind me like they were relieved. At home, I walked in just past 6. Sarah was already on the couch, wine glass in hand, feet up on the ottoman I'd built back when we still fixed things ourselves. "You're home early," she said, not looking away from her tablet. "I don't work there anymore," I said. I remember exactly how flat my voice sounded. She didn't flinch, didn't pause, just took a sip and said, "Well, maybe it's time you slow down." She said it like I'd tripped on a stair, like this was just another clumsy moment in a long parade of them. Then she got up to put the glass in the sink and went on talking about a dinner with her co-workers. One of them, Brian, apparently got promoted. She didn't look at me once. Funny how a voice can shrink to nothing inside a house you built. By the way, if you're still here, consider subscribing. Over 97% of you listen without hitting that button. It helps more than you think and motivates us to keep going. That night, I pulled out a sketchbook from a dusty bin in the garage. I hadn't touched it in years. Its pages were stiff, stained with old coffee rings and the imprint of hope. Inside was a skeleton, an architecture I'd designed over a decade ago. Back then, the company said it was too niche, not scalable. They were wrong. It just wasn't theirs to understand. The bones were still good. I started tracing lines with a mechanical pencil like I was resuscitating something I had buried too early. The software was an automation tool, written back when APIs weren't trendy and AI was just a movie gimmick. But now, it was exactly what small to mid firms needed: lean, fast, plug and play, and completely ignored by the suits who now thought realignment was a strategy. My hands still worked, my brain still fired, and there, in the margins of an old idea, was something I didn't expect to find. Stillness. Not peace, not yet, but a clear, sharp quiet, the kind that comes before a storm. 3 days after the sketchbook came out of hibernation, I got a call from someone I hadn't heard from since the Clinton administration. "Greg?" The voice crackled with surprise, hesitation, and just a pinch of panic. "It's Darren Voss." The name triggered a few dusty synapses. We'd worked together back when software was still burned onto CDs and every meeting smelled like dry erase markers. Darren was always two things, brilliant and just this side of chaos. Apparently, the chaos had won. He didn't even wait for small talk. "Listen," he said, "I'm about to lose everything. I need your brain." Turns out Darren had taken over a mid-sized software company specializing in logistics optimization. Sounded promising, until he explained they'd taken on too much VC money, signed over too much control, and then couldn't deliver the back-end tech the clients were promised. "Let me guess," I said. "You have a clunky data pipeline, zero modularity, and your integration layer is duct-taped with 6 third-party services that hate each other?" There was a pause. Then, "Jesus, Greg, yeah." I told him to send me the architecture doc. When it arrived, I didn't laugh. I just opened my sketchbook, turned to a page marked 14C, and held the two up side by side. His $12 million problem looked like a puzzle piece missing from my decade-old prototype. 80% compatibility, maybe more. The prototype was rough, but the core math hadn't aged. I stayed up 2 nights cleaning the code, modernizing the stack, and wrapping it in just enough UX to make it feel like something polished instead of something resurrected. Then I sent him a secure link with a 48-hour sandbox trial. He called me 16 hours later, crying. "We demoed it," he said. "Greg, the client signed an extension on the spot. They want to triple their order volume." I didn't ask for applause. I just asked, "How many contracts are you holding with lapsed clients?" 17. I paused. "Then here's what we do." By the end of the week, we inked the deal. $25 million, $5 million up front, $10 million in back-end licensing tied to client rollouts, and $10 million in acquisition options if he hit quarterly KPIs. I didn't even bother calling a lawyer. I wrote the first draft myself, sent it over to my old friend Leonard, who still worked corporate law, and watched the signatures land one by one. No champagne, no press release, just wire transfers and 2 new LLCs to route everything cleanly. I didn't smile, not then. I just sat back and looked at my sketchbook. The thing they all said was too old, too clunky, too not worth pursuing, had just bailed out a failing firm and bought me more power than any title ever had. Sarah didn't even notice the difference. She was out late that week, said she was helping Brian set up a presentation for his new role. I didn't ask questions. I just nodded. She came home once with a bottle of Pinot and didn't offer me a glass. That's when I started moving some money out of our joint account. Nothing she'd notice right away. Just enough to create the gap I knew I'd need later. In chess, pawns don't survive the opening, but they shape the board. And now, I wasn't a pawn anymore, not even close. I don't know why I didn't call first. Maybe part of me still wanted it to be normal. I'd just signed the biggest deal of my life, $25 million, clean, quiet, all mine. So I stopped by a bakery I used to pass every morning back when I commuted to the office like a sucker. Picked up a chocolate hazelnut torte, her favorite supposedly. I even bought a second one just in case the first got crushed on the ride home. The gate buzzed open as I drove up the circular path. Sarah's car was in the driveway. Good, I'd tell her in person. I imagined her reaction, surprise, maybe even a little awe. Not that I needed it, but it would have been something. The house was quiet when I walked in. Too quiet, if you've been married long enough. I carried the box into the kitchen, placed it gently on the counter, called out, "Hey, you here?" No answer. Then I heard it, laughter, not hers, a deeper voice, muffled, playful, bedroom. At first, my brain buffered, tried to explain it. Maybe she was on a call, maybe a podcast, maybe Brian was over for a meeting, a friendly chat. Maybe they were watching one of those leadership webinars she'd been pretending to care about lately. But then, silence, the kind that rushes in when someone hears something they weren't expecting to hear. My shoes didn't make a sound on the hardwood as I walked down the hall. Door cracked open, just enough to give me a preview of what I already knew. Sarah's laugh always had a little catch in it when she was tipsy. It was there now, paired with the slow rustling of sheets. I pushed the door. Brian was lying in my spot, shirtless, hair wet, like he just showered in my water, dried himself with my towel, and then decided to climb into my life for dessert. Sarah pulled the sheet up like modesty mattered now. I looked at them both, long enough for it to sting, for Brian to clear his throat and try to pretend this wasn't happening. He opened his mouth like he was about to deliver some corporate-grade nonsense, but I turned, didn't speak, didn't blink, just walked. "Greg, wait!" Sarah's voice chased me down the hall. "It's not what you think." "Oh no, Sarah, it's exactly what I think. Maybe worse." I picked up the torte box on my way out, not because I cared about dessert, but because I didn't want to leave anything sweet in that house. Let them figure out how bitter life gets when you burn the one man who knew where the gas lines were buried. She followed me to the porch in her robe, hair disheveled, still pretending this was salvageable. "Greg, please, can we talk?" I stopped at the edge of the steps, looked back once, not at her, but at the house. My house. The one I rebuilt after the flood. The one she'd filled with throw pillows and curated gallery walls and 1,000 little touches that said, "We." All lies now. I got in my car, closed the door, and as I backed out of the driveway, I noticed the window upstairs shift slightly. Brian watching, barely visible behind the curtain. No smugness, just fear. Good. He should be afraid, because unlike him, I don't fight in the bedroom. I fight in silence, and I always win where it hurts most. The hardest part wasn't seeing them. It was the day after, when I woke up alone in a short-term rental across from the old train yard. Cheap blinds, bare walls, the sound of clanking metal and pigeons fighting over trash on the roof. I sat there with a single mug of coffee and a laptop that hadn't been booted in 3 years. No music, no news, just silence. Then I opened a folder labeled archive_grg_v6 and started dragging files. I didn't rage, didn't scream. I transferred assets like I was deleting spam. The joint account we'd had for 22 years, gone. My half moved to a brokerage Sarah didn't know existed. Our real estate trust, rewritten with an addendum I drafted years ago when I still believed in prenups and paranoid planning. The garage full of tools, the inventory from my old consulting firm, the prototype drives, all packed and relocated to a storage unit registered under an LLC I opened that same morning. Greg Mason disappeared in 48 hours. What replaced him wasn't louder, just sharper, cleaner. The next week, I leased a small private office at a downtown co-working space. Most people there looked like they were still paying off grad school. No one asked questions when I rolled in with 2 monitors and a non-branded server box. I picked a corner room with no windows and a busted HVAC unit that wheezed like it had asthma. Perfect. No distractions. My first move, reactivating every old domain I'd ever owned, then the shell corporations, Nevada, Wyoming, Belize. I didn't need them to hide anything. I just needed layers. Enough layers to make even a seasoned forensic accountant second-guess their career choice. Sarah texted 3 days later. I made a mistake. Please come talk to me. Classic pivot, from defiance to confusion. I didn't reply. The next morning, another one came in. It didn't mean anything. You've been so distant lately. I muted the thread. Then Brian reached out. Subject line, let's be adults. His email was 1 paragraph long, reeking of smug civility. Greg, I'm sorry for how you found out. But emotions aside, I think we both know you and Sarah were in a difficult spot for a while. If you'd like to talk about how we navigate this maturely, I'm open. I closed the email, flagged it, saved it to a drive titled Fuel. Then I got back to work. By the end of the week, I'd acquired 2 dormant tech companies, both holding expired IP filings with overlapping language from contracts Brian's firm still used. One of them had a single asset, a clause embedded in a licensing framework I helped write 15 years ago, back when Brian was still printing spreadsheets in landscape mode. I renamed the company, quietly, after something Sarah would never notice, her childhood street name, just a little joke. For later. Grief had a strange shape in those days. It didn't cry, it calculated. It filed DBAs and trademarks while the other guy tried to figure out how to sleep next to a woman who called another man dead weight on the night of his firing. I didn't need revenge, I needed precision, and precision, unlike fury, doesn't miss. I was setting the board, and I'd already taken their queen. They just didn't know it yet. The call came in on a Thursday morning, standard business hours, nothing flashy. A polite woman from an external compliance firm requesting a review of Clause 9.4b in a 2011 vendor agreement used by Brian's firm. Nothing alarming, just procedural, she said. Routine backtracking as part of a data rights verification sweep. Brian didn't even take the call himself. It got rerouted to one of their junior legal analysts who skimmed the clause, shrugged, and slapped on the label that kills all curiosity, non-critical. Except it wasn't. Clause 9.4b was mine, buried in a vendor licensing agreement I authored back when I was still dumb enough to believe anyone read footnotes. It referenced ownership over derivative works, but only if the original IP had been substantially modified by third parties without a reissue. The clause had never been triggered before because the firm never knew I'd quietly built the reissue and never documented it. Until now. What followed wasn't a fire, it was a flicker that spread beneath the walls. Slowly, silently. 2 days later, their billing system flagged a discrepancy in a batch of API keys distributed to an Asian logistics partner. The access rights didn't match the contract terms anymore. A red flag. Legal double-checked and realized half of their current integration still operated under old architecture. That old architecture, now technically licensed, by me. The firm paused outbound renewals for 48 hours to review structural overlap. Brian didn't say anything publicly, but I know how that tension feels. The slow realization that the system you're standing on has a leak somewhere and no one knows where the water's coming from. Sarah felt it too, though she didn't know the source. Her texts to me had slowed. Instead, I heard from a mutual acquaintance, one of those floating social orbiters that knows just enough to be dangerous. She said Brian's been snappy lately, he told me over coffee. Tossed a tablet at a conference call, canceled a trip last minute, something about needing to secure his position. Sounded off. I sipped my coffee and smiled. Sarah, meanwhile, had no idea she was sharing a bed with a man being slowly squeezed dry. She still posted selfies at work mixers, captioned with lines like, "Teamwork makes the dream work," as if hashtags could glue together a company leaking from its foundation. I filed another request that Monday, this time under a different shell name, requesting royalty recalculations for a deprecated toolset that Brian's firm had bundled into 3 of their premium packages, the one still used by over 200 enterprise clients. It wasn't about the money, it was about documentation. paper trails, triggers. Each submission activated a chain reaction, automated reviews, internal queries, flags that no one could answer without pulling apart the very framework Brian had built his little empire on. And all the while, I didn't speak a word. No phone calls, no threats, just quiet filings and forgotten contracts that suddenly started breathing again. By Friday, his firm's audit team had to escalate the issue to outside counsel. They began scrambling to identify potential IP vulnerabilities. The phrase was buried deep in a memo that I knew would eventually reach the board. A week after the initial call, Brian canceled a public appearance, cited scheduling conflicts. Sarah told a friend he'd been off lately, distant, pacing, snapping at small things. She blamed stress. She always did. What she didn't know was that the pressure wasn't coming from outside his life. It was coming from beneath it. And the man applying that pressure never raised his voice, just moved the levers they thought were long broken. I built those systems. I knew where the cracks lived. Now I was feeding them, one quiet clause at a time. It started with a name. Sarah overheard it one night as Brian muttered into a phone call, pacing the living room in his socks with that agitated shuffle she used to associate with late quarter earnings reports. "Tell them Lexbridge Systems can take a number," he snapped, then ended the call with enough force to crack the screen protector. She asked, casual as ever, "Lexbridge?" He waved it off. "Small-time nuisance vendor trying to claim partial rights to a back-end protocol. We'll squash it." She nodded, but her ears held onto the name like a song you don't mean to memorize. That night, after Brian fell asleep to some half-drunk streaming show, she opened her laptop, searched Lexbridge Systems. The site was minimal, clean, maybe 2 pages. Black text on gray background, stock photos too generic to be real, no testimonials, no pricing, just one cryptic tagline under the company name: "Compliance isn't optional, it's leverage." But the kicker was LinkedIn. She nearly dropped her wine glass when the board list loaded. Gregory Mason, founding board member. Her stomach did something unfamiliar. It turned. The man she dismissed as checked out. The man she hadn't contacted in 2 weeks because her new life was easier this way. That man had a company, with a name she'd never heard, in a sector she didn't understand. She didn't mention it right away. She watched Brian instead. He was unraveling in subtle ways, double-checking his phone like he didn't trust it, rereading printed memos like they might disappear. She caught him staring at a contract folder one night like it was booby-trapped. 3 days later, she brought it up over breakfast. "So, Lexbridge? You said it's a vendor?" Brian barely looked up. "It's noise. Greg's behind it, trying to rattle us." She blinked. "Why didn't you tell me it was him?" His jaw tensed. "Because he's irrelevant." Later that day, Brian stormed into his office and slammed the door so hard one of the interns jumped. Sarah, who happened to be in the building for lunch, watched through the glass. An hour passed, then 2. Then came the email. Subject: access terminated, IP auth revoked. It was from one of their critical enterprise partners. Their integration tools, built atop legacy software Greg had helped design, no longer validated Brian's credentials. The entire interface had been restructured to require re-authentication through a new intermediary, Lexbridge Systems. Brian called the CTO, barking orders. "Override it, we wrote the damn code." But he hadn't. Greg had. Sarah saw the color drain from his face as the CTO explained in hushed tones that the language in the updated license agreement, approved by legal 6 months prior, gave Lexbridge temporary gatekeeping authority over derivative code modules flagged during compliance review. Brian hung up, sat in silence, stared at the screen. He looked smaller somehow, less like the man who once stood on stage giving TEDx talks about scalable disruption, and more like a guy realizing his entire world had been built on top of land he didn't own. Sarah didn't say anything. Not at first. She went home and poured a glass of wine, stared at the corner of the living room where Greg used to sit and sketch on napkins while pretending to watch TV. Back then, she thought it was a waste of time. Now she realized he wasn't doodling, he was planning. And Lexbridge? That wasn't just a company, it was a chess piece, a gatekeeper, a fuse, and it had Greg's fingerprints all over it. Brian woke up to the sound of his phone vibrating against the nightstand. 3 buzzes, 1 notification, subject: final confirmation, license transfer executed. The message came from a law firm he didn't recognize: Griffin, Layton, and Royce LLP. Clean formatting, official language, and at the bottom, his signature, his actual signature, date-stamped, time-coded, digital certificate verified through their internal DocuTrack system. Brian sat up in bed, blinking hard. He reread the email. Then again, the document outlined a transfer of core licensing rights for a middleware component, one his firm had used as part of every logistics bundle since 2017. The language was airtight. The signatory line was clear: Brian T. Collar, CEO. The thing was, he never signed it. But the system said he did. The audit trail checked out. The metadata was flawless. He forwarded it to legal with a single line. Where the hell did this come from? Sarah stirred beside him, groggy. What is it now? He didn't answer, just stood and walked to the kitchen in boxers, phone glued to his hand. An hour later, legal called, said the signature matched archived examples perfectly. It could have been executed under the old evergreen clause during platform migration, the associate offered weakly. Translation: someone found a loophole and used it, legally. Sarah watched him pace. For the first time since Greg's name had come back into their world, she felt something shift from discomfort to dread. This wasn't noise anymore. It was structure, a net closing. She retreated to the office upstairs and opened their joint investment portfolio. She hadn't checked it in weeks. Brian always handled that. But this time, curiosity had a knife in its hand. What she found wasn't just suspicious, it was surgical. Several holdings that once sat under her name, bond ladders, private tech index funds, even the REIT they'd co-purchased last spring, were now managed by proxy through a new firm she didn't recognize, Bayhurst Ventures. She clicked through their filings. Bayhurst Ventures was a Delaware-based holding entity owned by a trust. And that trust? It listed one public signatory, Gregory L. Mason. Her hand froze over the mouse. In real time, she watched the illusion of stability collapse into a spreadsheet of silence and signatures she couldn't trace. The man she had discarded had not just moved on, he had built a financial labyrinth around her life. She called Greg, no texts, no preamble, just raw panic as the line rang. He picked up after 3 rings. His voice was calm, too calm. Greg, she started, but her throat dried up. What the hell is Bayhurst Ventures? Why are half our assets listed under it? What are you doing? There was a pause, then, you're not part of this. Click. No goodbye, no explanation, just a deadline. She stared at the screen, pulse pounding in her ears. Upstairs, Brian was shouting at someone over speakerphone. Words like malicious compliance and retroactive escrow clauses ricocheted down the hallway, but none of it mattered anymore. This wasn't about infidelity, not anymore. This was structural erasure, legal suffocation, a clean, quiet dismantling of everything they'd assumed was untouchable. The man they called irrelevant had just made them disappear from their own balance sheet. At 9:04 a.m. on a Tuesday, Brian sat in a glass-walled boardroom with sweat pooling under his collar. The meeting wasn't on his calendar. The subject line had read simply, Emergency Governance Session, Attendance Mandatory. 8 board members were already seated when he arrived. 2 of them wouldn't meet his eyes. His usual seat had a folder resting on top of it. Inside, a forensic audit report, 3 internal memos, and 1 annotated copy of the 2017 Vendor Consolidation Agreement, the one Greg had helped draft before being realigned. At the center of the chaos, Lexbridge Systems, specifically the now legally enforced restructuring of IP ownership clauses, coupled with material financial disruptions caused by unverified license executions and rerouted asset paths. Plain English? Half the tech stack was no longer under their legal control, and Brian had signed it away, on paper, if not in reality. He started to object, something about bad actors and outdated documents, but the general counsel cut him off. We're not here to debate intent. We're here because derivative rights on over 40% of our deliverables have been suspended under clause-triggering review. Our clients are threatening arbitration, and you, she pointed, have no record of initiating due diligence. A vote followed. 8 raised hands, motion passed. Effective immediately, Brian's title was suspended, pending comprehensive review and reauthorization. They didn't fire him, not yet. That would come after the lawyers finished tightening the noose. He didn't speak on his way out. No slamming doors, no dramatic scene, just a man walking slowly toward the elevator, coat still on the back of his chair, dignity leaking out behind him like a punctured tire. Across town, Greg sat in a quiet cafe 3 blocks from his new office, sipping black coffee. No laptop, no phone out, just a paper contract in a leather folder, face down on the table. Across from him sat a man in his early 40s, sharp suit, soft voice, the kind who made fortunes in places no one talked about publicly. Are you sure? The man asked, gently sliding the contract toward himself. Greg nodded. The man glanced at the signature line. Lexbridge becomes the parent? He asked. No, Greg said calmly. Lexbridge stays the firewall. This, he tapped the contract, this is the vault. He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. The investor smiled, signed, shook Greg's hand without another word. When he left, Greg didn't move for a while. He sat there, alone in that corner booth, watching the drizzle beat on the window. The street outside looked like any other Tuesday, but somewhere, on the 20th floor of a high-rise Sarah used to boast about, Brian was staring into the abyss of consequence. And the thing about cold consequences, they don't come loud, they settle in your bones. Later that evening, Sarah would come home to find Brian sitting on the floor, surrounded by silent devices, phone, tablet, laptop, all dark, all useless. She'd ask what happened. He'd say nothing, because what do you say when the trap closes and the only thing left is your echo? Greg didn't celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. This wasn't revenge. It was calibration, the correction of imbalance. And the man who once walked out of his own home carrying a chocolate torte now held a dozen companies, 3 investor syndicates, and the silence of 2 people who thought they could rewrite him out of his own story. But the thing about stories, only the author gets the final word. It came in a small brown envelope. No return address, no markings, just her name typed in a plain white label. Sarah found it in the mailbox, wedged between a real estate flyer and the latest issue of Modern Home. For a moment she assumed it was junk, maybe marketing material from some obscure subscription service, but it had weight, just enough to make her pause. Inside was a single USB stick, black, unbranded. She stood in the kitchen holding it for a full minute before sliding it into her laptop. The screen flickered, loaded a single folder titled Exit_interview. Inside, 2 video files. She hesitated but clicked the first. The footage was clear, too clear. Security camera angle, high resolution, timestamped to the minute. Her bedroom, her, and Brian. She was in a silk robe, glass of wine in hand, reclining on the bed like she'd already made peace with something. Brian sat beside her, shirt open, grinning like he'd just won a bet. The timestamp read, 10:42 p.m., the night Greg had been fired. She remembered that night, the false concern in her voice when Greg came home early, the way she poured him tea and asked, "Are you okay?" While knowing full well she was already mentally gone. She hit play. The audio was crisp, enhanced, every breath, every word. Sarah's voice, soft and triumphant. Finally, we're free of him. He was just dead weight. Brian chuckled. He won't fight back. He never does. Greg folds. It's what he does. Sarah's face in that moment, smug, like a child getting away with stealing cookies while the house burned around her. She paused the video, couldn't look at the screen. Her throat tightened. She clicked the second clip, hoping, maybe foolishly, it would redeem the first. It was shorter, lower angle, audio only, but the voices were unmistakable. Sarah again. He's already boxed up his office. You should take the promotion. It's yours now. He won't contest it. Brian. And if he does, we'll call it instability. Hell, let's just say it's early onset burnout. Silence. Then, he's not even a threat. He just disappears when he's cornered. She sat motionless, fingers trembling on the trackpad. There was no sender, no message, no threat. Just proof, delivered like a ghost whisper into her perfect little kitchen. She knew what it meant. Greg had known. From the very beginning. That night, the look in his eyes, when he turned from the bedroom without a word, it wasn't ignorance. It was decision. He wasn't stunned. He wasn't lost. He was calculating. The realization hollowed her out. This wasn't some act of desperate revenge thrown together in heartbreak. This was built, engineered, from the very moment they thought he was done. She looked across the living room at Brian, now slouched on the couch, jaw clenched, scrolling through his emails like they held a secret escape hatch. He didn't notice her staring, didn't see the tear slip down her cheek, because it wasn't just guilt, it was dread. They thought they'd gutted a man and walked away clean, but he'd seen the knife coming, let it happen, and then sharpened it, in silence, in shadows. And now it was their turn to bleed. The house was quieter than usual, no arguing, no clinking wine glasses, no performative laughter echoing off marble countertops. Brian was packing in the den, methodical, distracted, folding suits into garment bags like a man going somewhere he didn't choose. His jaw locked, his hands robotic. He hadn't said much since the video surfaced. There wasn't much to say. Sarah paced the hallway like a caged animal. She'd already called 3 lawyers, 2 financial advisors, and one of Brian's ex-colleagues who now ghosted her after hearing the word Lexbridge. No one had answers. No one had a plan. Just apologies and "we'll get back to you" messages she knew meant never. Then Brian's phone buzzed. He froze. The screen lit up. One line of text from an unknown number. ETA, 3 minutes. You may want to step outside. He swallowed hard, walked slowly to the window, pulled back the curtain, and whispered, "Oh my God, it's—" Sarah rushed over, heels clicking on tile. Greg stood at the edge of the driveway, calm, alone, but not really. Behind him, a black town car, a court official with a briefcase, a lawyer in a pressed navy suit, and a small press van with the logo of a mid-tier business journal stenciled on the side. He wasn't yelling, wasn't storming the place, just standing there, hands in his coat pockets, eyes locked on the house like he was watching the final act of a play he'd already seen. Sarah opened the front door halfway. "Greg, what is this?" Her voice cracked. He didn't answer her, didn't even look at her directly. Instead, he turned slightly, nodded toward the lawyer. The lawyer stepped forward and unfolded a document, 2 pages, clean, sealed in a thick plastic sleeve. Per the terms of Trust Entity 472B, the property is no longer legally in your possession. It is not registered to either Sarah Collar or Brian Collar. It has been held since 2018 under a business trust formed during the rezoning process of this neighborhood. Brian appeared in the doorway behind her, face pale. "That's not possible," he muttered. "This is her house. She inherited it." The court officer stepped forward. The previous title holder transferred ownership into a trust via a 98% silent interest override during a property tax reassessment. The remaining 2% was later acquired through a joint capital infusion. He paused. "From Gregory Mason." Sarah's breath hitched. She remembered signing something years ago, a bundle of refinance documents Greg had handed her in a hurry, telling her it was to lower the insurance premium. She hadn't read past page 2. She hadn't cared. The gate locks clicked behind Greg. The sound wasn't loud, but it might as well have been thunder, mechanical, final, inescapable. Greg finally spoke, quietly. "You took the bed," he said, gaze steady, voice dry. Then he nodded toward the ground beneath their feet. "I took the ground it stood on." He turned and walked back toward the car. No drama, no smile, just a man done. Behind him, the lawyer handed the court officer a small key fob. The man pressed a button, and the front door's smart lock chirped, denying access to Sarah's phone app before she could even lift it. Brian sank into the doorway, half inside, half out, like a man trying to decide if the air outside would burn more than what he left behind. Sarah stood in silence. No one screamed, no one pleaded, because this wasn't a fight. It was an extraction, with documents, dates, digital trails, and not a single word wasted.